Hey folks, it's Miss Sinclair for AP World History Modern. Today we're finishing up our Unit 4 lectures on Transoceanic interconnections. We will be learning about the Atlantic system and Africa. For your bell work, I would like you to describe the economic foundation of the different colonies in the Americas. So, what was the basis of their economies? So today we're learning about 4.6, Africa and the Atlantic system. We're covering a lot of objectives in this unit and in this lesson in particular. So your objectives will align with topic 4.4, 4.5, and 4.6, but we're going to focus on changes and continuities in the systems of slavery in this period and the different ways that rulers used economic strategies to maintain power. Okay, let's get started. So, the West Indies, first of all, is the Caribbean, right? East Indies being like Indonesia. So before 1650, the groups colonizing in the Caribbean would primarily have been chartered companies. These are groups of private investors who paid an annual fee to France and England in exchange for a monopoly over trade to the West Indies colonies. They would primarily use indentured servants, and they would grow tobacco on the Caribbean islands. But tobacco is going to be able to be grown very effectively in Virginia. So these Caribbean plantations will switch to sugar. England and France will rely on private investors in their chartered companies to really develop their Caribbean colonies. So we are still seeing unequal labor systems in play, right? Europe is switched from one unequal labor system, feudalism, to another with slavery. Human labor is vital for producing low-cost goods. And when you have population loss of Native Americans due to disease, it will lead to an increase in the imported slave labor to the New World. So, apart from the slave trade, much of Africa is still untouched by Europeans, thanks to its geography. So let's talk a little bit about the pre-existing slave trade. The Trans-Saharan trade routes and in East Africa, trade routes had been trading slaves for centuries. So it's not like the Europeans roll up and are like, hey, have you ever thought about enslaving your neighbors? Right? Slavery had already existed in these systems, in the Indian Ocean maritime system, in the Trans-Saharan maritime system. Women were primarily traded to be concubines in harems or domestic servants. A few men would be traded to use as soldiers or field workers, usually in salt or gold mines. So these were systems that were already in place. However, I think it's important to understand that the chattel slavery that the Europeans will develop is very different from the slavery that had been in place for hundreds of years. The slavery that had already been in place is going to be much more similar to Roman or Greek slavery. You're still a slave, for these women being traded as concubines, it's sexual slavery for them, or going to go work in a salt mine. These are not pleasant things. However, more of these slaves will be incorporated into communities, right? You might live in the house. These slaves are not seen as subhuman. It is merely sort of a social status. So Europeans will simply tap into the existing routes and supplies of slaves. So they are going to use the fact that slavery had already existed in Africa to justify their own enslavement of Africans in the New World. And by the mid-1400s, Europeans began to utilize slaves in Europe as household servants. You still had other forms of servitude used by Europeans: indentured servants, impressment, which is where the Navy would just go around and just grab random men off the street, knock them out, put them on a ship, sail out to sea, and be like, well, you're in the middle of the ocean now. You got to work for us. What are you going to do? Jump off the boat and drown? So let's talk a little bit about the relationship between sugar and slavery. Well, the Portuguese are really going to be the ones to start this in a big way. The Portuguese need slaves to grow their cash crops on their islands, first like Cape Verde, but then also in Brazil. So the success of using slaves to grow sugar on their islands in the Atlantic will lead Portugal to further invest in the slave trade. And in 1441, the first slaves will be brought to Portugal from Africa. So Portugal really will establish outposts, fortresses, all along the coastlines of Africa. And one of the things that Portugal's trade empire is going to have to do is, since they are just located on ports, they have to work with local African rulers. So the Portuguese, in fact, will trade manufactured goods for slaves and other raw materials, spices, gold, from these African rulers. And the Portuguese will really be impressed by the organization of many African kingdoms like the Congo, Benin, Mali, the Songhai. So, as the Portuguese very effectively used slavery in their plantations located in the Atlantic Ocean, they will expand slavery to the Caribbean. So soon, the Caribbean will surpass Brazil in terms of sugar production, and so we see an increase of the slave trade from Africa. So we have in 1502 the first African slaves arriving in the Americas. Slave trade will become increasingly important as plantations, in particular sugar and tobacco plantations, demanded constant labor. By 1600, the slave trade dominated all other kinds of commerce on the African coast. Portugal controlled most of the African coastal slave trade until 1637, when the Dutch seized the fortress of Elmina in 1637. So that removes the Portuguese monopoly on the slave trade. So by the 17th century, the Dutch, the English, the French are all competing with the Portuguese in the slave trade, right? It's important to keep in mind, we're not talking about abstract economic concepts here. These are the lives of men and women and children. While all this is happening, we are still seeing our Trans-Saharan slave trade as well. So please watch these videos on slavery. It is really important for you to understand this key part of world history, because it involves migration, forced migration, the mixing of cultures, the oppression of people, the exploitation of people. We can't just learn about the triumphs of history. We must also look at its failures. So you can see a lot of slaves will come from the western coast. Over time, it'll be about 10 to 15 million people will be brought over. So I like this GIF because you can really see every dot represents a ship going back and forth over the years. So you can see this just constant shipment of people back and forth across the Atlantic. And you can see most of them are going to Brazil and the Caribbean. So one of the things we'll see is in the North American continent, the slave population is going to be able to have a higher life expectancy and thus self-perpetuate the population, whereas in the Caribbean and in Brazil, the life expectancy is so short, you need to continue importing slaves. So take a moment to reflect. What other kinds of slave trades existed prior to European involvement? All right, let's talk a little bit about plantation life. So farming on these plantations is very difficult, right? It takes a lot of labor to grow sugar. However, it doesn't necessarily take a lot of sophisticated skill, right? So growing sugar is a relatively simple process. It's just hard work. All you need are simple tools like a machete, hose, spades. So you grow the sugar cane. It grows like 20 feet tall. And then you go through and you chop it down. To then get sugar out of the sugar cane, it goes to mills where it is crushed and the juices are extracted. Lead-lined troughs would carry the cane juice to large copper kettles where the sugar is boiled, leaving a really thick syrup. You place the syrup into cone clay molds, the syrup crystallizes, and then you can break it apart into like sugar. Europeans, of course, want to make this process efficient and profitable. And so it leads them to have extreme exploitation of not only people, but the environment, right? In Jamaica, they will use so much of the land for sugar production that they will have to import food from North America because they don't have enough land to support the population there. So the environmental impact of these plantations is enormous. You have the mills powered by water, wind, or animals. Boilers to boil up all this sugar water will be used by burning the crushed cane. You'll fertilize it with manure. But this is really intensive agriculture. They are doing no crop rotation. They are not leaving the fields in fallow. So one crop would really remove all the nutrients from the soil. So rather than having good land management, they would just clear more jungle. So you have increased deforestation. The introduction of non-native plants and animals like bananas, plantains, okra, black-eyed peas, yams will help support this population. But these non-native plants and animals will crowd out native ones, right? Rats will eat baby birds and diminish populations. So let's talk a little bit about slave lives. You have this sort of social class in these colonies of almost aristocrats, right? They are not necessarily landed in the sense of like, oh, this is Lord so-and-so, but they own so much land and they have so much wealth that even if in Europe they wouldn't necessarily be considered an aristocrat, in the New World, they basically are. So you have these rich men who own most of the slaves and most of the land. And then you have a small group of estate managers, government officials, artisans, small farmers. So when you look at the population distribution on these Caribbean islands, slaves outnumbered the white Europeans by a lot, right? You have the super rich families, a few white, sort of officials doing various jobs, accountants, and then maybe you have a handful of free blacks who owned property and entered commerce. But plantations will really become the focus of African slave life. So Atlantic slaves were primarily men and would be used for plantation labor. And you had three groups. There was the Great Game, these are the strongest slaves who did the heaviest work. The second gang, who would be youths, like 12-year-olds, and the elderly, those who are less fit, but still active. And then the grass gang, who would be little children and the oldest slaves who would watch over the children, who would be responsible for weeding and simple work. Women often formed the majority of field laborers, and nursing mothers would have to just take their babies out into the fields with them, right? I am currently 35 weeks pregnant, very uncomfortable. These women would have to be out there doing back-breaking labor in the hot Caribbean sun while they are super pregnant and then get no time to recover after birth. Slaves too old for field labor would watch the toddlers. And the reason why you will see that men were primarily imported from Africa is because of the high mortality rate. Some men would be used for non-field work like livestock care, blacksmiths, or a carpenter. But this is the general distribution in most of our plantations. You see predominantly sugar plantations in Brazil and the Caribbean, and cotton and tobacco plantations in British North America. So, let's talk a little bit about American slave societies. Well, you have some different terms, just like we kind of had in our Spanish colonies, peninsulares, Creoles, etc. Same kind of idea. You have your saltwater slaves. These are people who have been recently imported from Africa, right? They were born in Africa. Creole slaves, these are slaves who were born in the Americas. They are the descendants of African slaves. And many of these Creole slaves would be mulattoes, so mixed race, as a result of the sexual exploitation of slave women. So you have this hierarchy of slaves created by slave owners, right? If they can keep slaves from uniting against them, if they can encourage infighting and rivalries within the slave population, that really benefits their power structure. So Creole slaves and mulattoes will be given more opportunities to acquire skilled jobs, such as household servants. Planters rewarded skilled slaves with better quality food or clothing, perhaps even time off. But most would still work very hard for fear of the lash, so of being whipped. If you fell behind because you were exhausted or you were sick or you just collapsed from the heat, you would be whipped. You worked from sunrise to sunset, and punishment for rebellion or escape would be flogging, which is whipping, confinement in irons, or even mutilation, having body parts cut off. So family formation will be incredibly difficult for slaves because families can be separated at any time. The male to female ratio on these plantations will be sometimes 3-1. And technically, slaves didn't work on Sunday, but that's the only day that they had to work around their own home to try and grow some food for their own survival, to try and build a house, wash clothes. So this means there's no time for fun, education, or family. Now, let's be clear. We will talk about the development of culture in these slave communities. But what I'm trying to make clear here is that this is an incredibly dehumanizing system. So the mortality rate of slaves is incredibly high. You have a low natural increase rate, right? So due to overwork and poor nutrition, it will be very difficult for women to get pregnant. And if you do become pregnant, it is very difficult for you to carry your child to term, right? Have your baby survive the entire pregnancy without miscarrying. And once the baby is born, to get enough nutrition for yourself to feed your own body and breastfeed your child. So the infant mortality rate is very high. So overall, low natural increase rate. Plus, you add in disease, accidents from mills. So the life expectancy of a slave in Brazil was 23 years old for men and 25 years old for women. The planters viewed it in straight economic sense, like, right? They're not viewing these slaves as human beings. It was cheaper to import a new slave from Africa than to raise one from birth. So when you bought a slave, they would first have to go through this seasoning, a difficult period of adjustment to new climates, disease, the environment, work routines, right? You're taken out of your community in Africa. You are sent across the ocean. And remember, there's no guarantee that you've ever seen the ocean before, right? You could be from an arid inland part of Africa. All of a sudden, you're sent across the ocean to a hot, humid jungle where you might get dysentery and malaria, where no one can speak your language. You are far from your family, your gods, everything you are familiar with. So because of the high mortality rate, you have this increased volume of slaves. So this meant an ever-increasing slave trade. So the majority of slaves in the Caribbean and in Brazil will be Africa-born, with practicing African religions, speech, styles, and music. So these regions here along the western coast of Africa are the predominant areas of origin for African slaves. These Trans-Saharan routes, the ones that are smaller, you will see more women being sold and trafficked along these routes to be used as domestic servants or sexual slaves. Whereas here, going across to the plantations in the New World will predominantly be men. All right, please watch this video from the History Channel. So let's talk a little bit about religion and rebellions, right? As these Africans arrive in the Americas, they bring their religious beliefs with them. Now, the Europeans are going to say, oh, you must become Christian. And Christianity will become popular among some slave groups because it talks about justice. It talks about the freeing of slaves, how there's an eternal rest, there's judgment coming. However, African religions will continue despite the attempts of slave owners to suppress them. Often Christianity and African religions will be fused together. So you have the emergence of these synchronized religions. So an example might be voodoo, which will develop in the Caribbean, which is a mix of Christianity and traditional West African religious trends. And some African nobles and religious leaders will still exercise authority within these communities. Slaves did rebel, and they rebelled frequently, but almost always unsuccessfully, right? In Jamaica, you had a slave named Tacky who will attack several plantations, set them on fire, kill the planters' families. However, here's the problem with it, right? You're still on an island in Jamaica. What do? You can't get on a boat and sail back to Africa. A, what part of Africa did you come from? B, do you know how to operate a 16th century sailing ship? So even if you defeat your plantation owner, you're still stuck there. What are you going to do? Just wait until the Europeans send more men with guns and cannons? Oftentimes, these rebellions were small failures, and the leaders would be tortured to death to deter others. Europeans would really try to repress African cultures because they thought it led to rebellion. So they would require you to speak the colonial language, discouraging your native tongue. This is one of the reasons why you have the emergence of these creolized language like Haitian. And since these slaves are coming from different parts of Africa, they don't necessarily speak the same language to begin with. So your lingua franca is the language of your colonizer. You did have some free blacks in the New World as well. So the process of manumission is a grant of legal freedom to an individual slave. It will be more common in Spanish and French colonies than in British ones. Most free blacks will purchase their own freedom. So it might be if you're a skilled slave as a carpenter, right? Your slave owner might hire you out to a neighbor to do some work, and you might be paid for that labor. Since slave status came through the mother, most families would try to free the women first, so any children born of that family would be born free. You also have the creation of maroon societies. So if you're on an island, you don't have a lot of options. But if you are in Brazil, if you are in the American South, you could just run away and disappear into the jungle or into the Everglades. And so you have the formation of these communities in remote areas, which would really serve as havens for escaped slaves. So this video will tell you a little bit about one of these maroon societies. So how should we remember the white men and women who lived at this time? How should we view their participation in this system? Here's what I want to push back on. Obviously, there is great evil done to the men and women who are forced into slavery. My question is, do we hold every white person complicit in that? Are they all as responsible as the actual plantation owners or the men who captained the slave ships? What if you lived in the North and you didn't have any slaves, but you bought sugar that was produced on a slave plantation? What if you just lived in a community that had slaves, but you didn't own any, and you were nice to the slaves, but it's not like you tried to stop the system, right? When you saw a slave being beat, you would look away, but you would never beat a slave yourself. Are you culpable? Here's the question that I want us to wrestle with. In our own modern world, we know that many of the cheap goods that we enjoy and experience here in the United States are produced from labor systems that are oppressive and unfair, right? Sweatshops in Asia, the fact that Disney movies like Mulan used some labor from the Uyghur concentration camps in China, right? If you watch that movie, are you now culpable as well? So as we look at history and we wrestle with this question, how do we view these people who actively participated in this system and passively participated in it? Are they all automatically evil and racist? You may conclude that they are, but I want you to really wrestle with this question, please. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the Atlantic system in general. So this is an economic system, right? It is during this time you have the emergence of capitalism. Capitalism is an economic system of large financial institutions like banks, stock exchanges, and investment companies that first developed in early modern Europe. This economic system allowed for the expansion of credit and would allow for merchants and investors to work far from home. We've already defined mercantilism. Mercantilism will really be the popular economic theory during the 17th and 18th centuries. So the prosperity of a nation is really dependent on its capital, right? The idea that governments should export more goods than they import. And to do this effectively, you need to utilize your colonies to import raw materials at an incredibly cheap price. So all this can be highly profitable. We have triangle trade emerging, which is going to be the trade between Europe, Africa, and the New World. So Europe would pass along, where is it? Okay, so I'll go back, but Europe will pass along manufactured goods to Africa to get slaves. Slaves will then go to the Americas. The goods produced by the slaves will then go to Europe, and the cycle continues. So the Royal Africa Company is going to be an English company because the English wanted their own source of slaves for the use of plantations on the Caribbean colonies. So they would establish forts in Africa to obtain slaves. So you see a lot of conflict between the Dutch, the British, and the French over overseas trade. And in the end, the Dutch will lose influence. So the Atlantic system, sometimes referred to as the Atlantic Circuit, is a network of trade routes that connected Europe, Africa, and the Americas. Triangle trade is a commercial arrangement by which African slaves were shipped to the Americas, sugar and tobacco were carried to Europe, and European manufactured goods were taken to Africa. Things like metal, hardware, guns, cotton textiles. So in Europe, an increased demand for sugar directly leads to an increased demand for slaves. There's a million of these graphs. You would totally expect to see one on an AP test or something about triangle trade. So this part of the trade, slaves to Africa, is known as the Middle Passage. It's the part of the Atlantic Circuit involving the transportation of enslaved Africans to the Americas. So between 1502 to 1850, about 12 million Africans will be shipped across the Atlantic. But the highest volume will be traded during the 18th century. The mortality rate on these slave ships was 15 to 20%. So mortality was high, fertility was low, and so you have this increasing demand for more and more African slaves. The cargo sizes varied, sometimes as high as 800 Africans on one ship. When food supplies or water ran low, they would usually just throw the weakest slaves overboard to drown. This is an incredibly traumatic experience. Slaves were taken from their homes, branded with hot irons, shackled and abused throughout the journey. They would keep men shackled together so they wouldn't commit suicide and kept under the deck most of the day, right? You can see how they're laying so close together on top of each other. Slaves were dirty, unsanitary. Many suffered from poor hygiene, dysentery, disease, extreme anxiety, PTSD, illness. And so you had frequent suicides and attempts at slave resistance. The Middle Passage subjected slaves to horrible and inhumane conditions. So all of this is leading to increasing Western power, European power. There were still challenges in place for European traders, though. Muslim traders remained active along the African coast, in the East African coast, and in the Middle East and Indian Ocean. You had piracy in the Caribbean. And then, of course, European countries are always fighting each other. please watch this video as well. So you can see some of our major kingdoms in Africa. So this is a useful map to look at because it will allow you to really see the distribution of our different African kingdoms that are dominant during this time. So you can see which areas are the major source of slaves and the distribution of large African communities and cities. So Africa is going to participate in the slave trade, right? It's not just that Europeans show up and start snatching people off of the coastline. We see that the Europeans have set up small ports along the African coast and sell Asian and European goods for slaves. They negotiate with West African kings and merchants. And they generally are not going to travel inland because of disease, climate, and general geographic challenges. The one exception to this will be the Dutch colony on the Cape of Good Hope, Cape Colony, which will serve as a sort of halfway point to resupply ships as they go to and from Asia. So, slaves will be traded for firearms, which will allow African states to expand and overpower their neighbors, which will result in more slaves. Slaves were primarily prisoners of war or captives from slave raids against neighboring African kingdoms or villages. Now, this has always been true, but usually it was you got some prisoners of war from attacking your neighboring kingdom, and they just served as your cook, right? They just served as a domestic servant in your community. They were not shipped across the ocean to die on a plantation. So the increasing violence among African communities is a result of this desire to satisfy European demand for slaves because they also want more European goods, right? So because Europeans want more slaves, they are willing to trade more goods to Africans. And because African kingdoms want those goods, they will attack more of their neighbors. So we see an increase in the slave trade after 1700 because of the increased production of cash crops like sugar. North America will be less dependent on imported Africans because the life expectancy of slaves in North America will be significantly higher than that in the Caribbean. And so they have a positive natural increase rate. So African rulers typically would not enslave their own people, but would enslave neighboring peoples. Once the Europeans traded for Africans, the slaves would be forced to march to trade towns, often separated from families. 25 to 33% of slaves would die just on this part of the journey. Slaves would be primarily taken from West Africa. However, simultaneously, 3 million slaves were taken by Muslim traders for our Trans-Saharan slave trade routes as well. This will create an African diaspora, the dispersion of Africans across the globe as a result of forced migration of the slave trade. African cultures were forced to adapt to the location in which they arrive and will continue to retain unique African elements. So the endless wars between African kingdoms and tribes promoted the importance of weaponry. Powerful African communities quickly became those who were willing to sell slaves to Europeans. The result is this gun-slave cycle. Increased firepower allowed African states to expand over their neighbors, producing more slaves, which they got for more guns. The result will be unending warfare and disruption of societies through slave trade. Europeans simply intensified the African enslavement that already existed. So here's, again, a complicated part of history. It would be incorrect to say that the Europeans are the only villains in this scenario, right? They could have offered guns to African kingdoms, and the Africans living there could have said, no, thank you. We aren't going to buy your guns, and we're not going to sell you human beings, right? You see that Africans are actively participating in this system of dehumanization and violence, as well as Europeans. So European trade with Africa will grow tremendously after 1650. And the growth of the slave trade will be accompanied by continued trade in other goods. However, it's not going to lead to any significant European colonization of Africa. African merchants were really discriminating about what they bought from the Europeans and would raise the price of slaves to in response to increased demand. So, African governments on the Gold Coast and the Slave Coast were strong enough to make Europeans observe African trading customs. And since Europeans were competing with each other, French versus Portuguese versus Dutch, they are going to be unable to present a single, strong, united bargaining position. So, let's talk a little bit about, where am I? So, you see this just massive amounts of slave trade. Those sold into slavery would sometimes be debtors or convicted criminals as well. African traders who specialized in procuring people for the slave trade did business at inland markets or fairs and then would bring the slaves to the coast. Angola, you can see it located right down here, is going to be the largest source of African slaves in the Atlantic world. And they will primarily partner with Portuguese. So the enslavement of this many people will actually cause an environmental and a demographic crisis in Africa. So, or rather, it will cause a demographic crisis, but an environmental crisis leads to increased slavery. So because during this time, there's going to be some massive droughts in West Africa, this will force refugees to flee to better kingdoms to access water and resources. Many of these kings will sell the refugees to slave dealers in exchange for goods, and then will use those goods to cement alliances and build a larger state. So the Atlantic system is always going to be based on a partnership between European traders and a few African political and merchant elites who benefited from the trade. But most Africans will suffer due to this trade. So, where am I? Okay, some of the effects of this slave trade are going to be I'm sorry, I lost my place in my notes. Queen Nzinga is a great example of this. She will be a queen of an African kingdom, and eventually she will be betrayed by other Africans and enslaved as a result of this gun slave cycle. So here's another great map showing which areas really dominated and where slaves were coming from and where they were going. So Angola is the largest source of slaves in the Atlantic world. I said that, and I actually already talked about the environment. So let's talk about the Trans-Saharan slave routes. Well, we see that Muslim territorial dominance in North Africa is going to be very significant. The Ottoman Empire controlled basically all of North Africa except for Morocco, and the Muslims were taking large amounts of territory in Ethiopia at this time as well. In the 1580s, Morocco will attack the sub-Saharan Muslim kingdom of Songhai and occupy the area for the next two centuries. This will cause the bulk of the Trans-Saharan trade to shift from the Western Sudan to Central Sudan. So the Trans-Saharan slave trade is smaller in volume than the Atlantic one. It will supply slaves to be part of a personal slave army of Moroccan rulers, slaves for some plantation labor, but also servants, artisans, and the Trans-Saharan slave trade will see a lot more women than men being traded to use as concubines or servants, or children will be traded to be made into eunuchs meant for service as harem guards. So Muslims had no moral objections to owning or trading in slaves. However, religious law forbade the enslavement of fellow Muslims. But this really wasn't followed very closely. Muslim influences, cultural influences, south of the Sahara were much stronger than European cultural influences. Islam and Arabic will spread more quickly than Christianity and English. And the European and Muslim slave trade did not have a significant effect on the overall population of the African continent. However, they did have an acute effect on certain areas of Africa from which large numbers of people were taken into slavery. So, for example, the higher proportion of women being taken across the Sahara in the Muslim slave trade will magnify the long-term demographic impact of the slave trade. The fact of the matter is, while vast numbers of people suffered from this system, a minority really profited from it. Both African, European, and Muslim merchants and elites will benefit from this trade. So what about the abolition of slavery? Well, we're not really going to start to see active abolition of slavery until the 19th century. Over time, economic, political, and religious changes occurring in Europe and the colonies will promote a change in attitude towards slavery. Opponents of slavery and the brutality of the trade really begin to appear in the mid 18th century. And this is in part a response to Enlightenment thinkers. Slavery was seen as backwards, immoral, inhumane, and cruel. So, in 1807, the British abolished the slave trade. In 1865, the U.S. abolishes slavery. And it's not going to be until 1888 that the Brazilian slave trade is abolished. So what's the impact of all this on the New World? Well, the profits from the colonies will bring Europe a lot of wealth and capital. White settlers from Europe will transplant Western ideas into the New World. We see an increase in slavery. Though this first globalized economy brings benefits to many, sugar and those crops will lead to population booms. We'll see increasing colonial rivalries, new foods and wider trade patterns, and imports of silver. So let's finish off this very long lecture on with some practice questions. So here is our source. It's a graph. The trend shown on the graph above is best explained by the expansion of the production of The trend shown on the graph above is best explained by Those are basically the same question. All right, here's a source. The map above illustrates which of the following? In what ways did more minor routes on the map differ from more major routes? So for your summary, please explain changes and continuities in systems of slavery in the period 1450 to 1750, and explain how rulers employed economic strategies to consolidate and maintain power. Thanks for listening. If you have any questions, please ask. Have a great day.